As we started this discussion about the Restoration Movement, we pointed out that this was a movement that focused on unity based upon the truth of God's Word, but that the ultimate purpose was to win the world to Christ. It was evangelism and missions. And so what I want to talk about now is the idea of missions within the Restoration Movement. Basically, there are two forms of missions that will develop. You have organized missions where you have a missionary that's sent out by an organization, by a society, a missionary society. And this is going to be sort of the prominent idea of missions in the early 1800s. That's the emerging idea of what missions should be. You apply within a society, the society sends you out, and you're supported through that. But what will develop a little bit later and will come along as well within the Restoration Movement is the idea of independent or direct support missions. And these are missionaries that go out with the support of a church or a group of church or a group of supporters that help pay them and help keep them going. And instead of being under the control of an organization, they go out and they're under the leadership or control of maybe a church or of a board of directors who directs their personal mission. And so these are the ideas that will emerge. And the first idea, this organized mission approach, is going to be the prominent approach that begins within the Restoration Movement. In 1849, there will be a meeting, a sort of assembly of people from the Restoration Movement that come together. They meet for their first national assembly in Cincinnati. And it's not going to be a huge group, but you're going to have a group that comes together. And as they come together for this assembly, they're going to talk about ways that they can work together and they can approach this idea of missions and reaching the world for Christ and many other topics of what they can do as Christians. And one of the things that will emerge is the development of the American Christian Missionary Society. And you're going to have this society that's formed, and even though Alexander Campbell is not there at this convention, he's going to be elected as the first president of this group. So we're going to call this the ACMS, the American Christian Missionary Society. So the American Christian Missionary Society forms. They are going to send out their first missionaries, who will be James Turner Barclay and his wife. J.T. Barclay is going to serve 2 terms in Jerusalem. And there's a sort of an apocalyptic idea. We've got to go to the Jews first and reach them. And so we're going to go out there and win the Jews to Christ. And so Barclay is going to go there. Barclay's an interesting guy. He becomes one of Campbell's son-in-laws and marries one of Campbell's daughters. But he goes out there onto the mission field. Barclay, he lived at Monticello. After Jefferson died, he bought Monticello and lived there for a while before he ultimately became a Christian and decided that he's going to go on to the mission field. So he goes to the mission field, very, very limited, almost no success, to be honest with you. His first term, he converts a few people. Actually, he does more discovery and writing about the Holy Land than anything else, but not much success. Goes back the second time, and the few that he had won were pretty much lost. They'd gone back to their former ways of life and were no longer very much involved with Christianity, so not much success. The second missionary they sent out from the ACMS is going to be Alexander Cross. And Alexander Cross was a former slave who was purchased from his owner so that they could educate him and give him his freedom. And it was a church in Kentucky that purchased him to give him his freedom, and they brought him to the Christian faith and the Christian ideals. And so he agreed he was going to become a missionary. He's going to go to Liberia. In Liberia, there had been a colony that had been established, and many people were, through this organization called the American Colonization Society, they were purchasing slaves and sending them back to Africa, to Liberia. And so Cross says, I'm going to go to Liberia, I'm going to preach the gospel there, and I'm going to be a missionary to these former slaves. And so he goes to Liberia. He's warned, be very careful, because the climate and the temperature and all that is a different climate. It's easy to get sick, and he didn't pay a great deal of attention, and literally he died very shortly after getting there, and so almost no success with this. Throughout its history, the American Christian Missionary Society seemed to be struggling constantly to have finances and to be successful in the efforts that they were undertaking. And they really didn't have a tremendous amount of success. Some years later, as this Society of the Disciples, as the General Assembly of the Disciples of Christ met in Cincinnati, you're going to have some women who begin the idea of promoting the thought of a women's missionary society. How could the women get involved? And they could raise the funding, and they could do the things to create a successful missionary society to go out into the world. So Carolyn Neville Pierre, the wife of a minister, is going to push this idea, and in 1874, she and some others will develop the Christian Woman's Board of Missions, the Christian Women's Board of Missions, the CWBM. And this is going to send W.H. Williams to Jamaica, and he will go there from 1872 to 74 and have limited success. And the Christian Women's Board of Missions, they're going to be somewhat successful. One of the good things that they're going to do, one of the interesting things they will do, in 1910, they're going to establish a school of missions. And this school of missions was formed at Butler University in Indianapolis. And it's going to be successful. The idea was, as students are studying at Butler, they might come over to the school and take a few classes on missions and be prepared and equipped to go out to the mission field. And so it worked out somewhat well. It worked out well enough that later Yale University took over and moved the whole School of Missions to Yale University. And so this is going to be somewhat successful. Around that same time, in 1874, as this is founded, you're going to have another group of men that begin to think, we've got to make a more successful society for missions, for evangelism in the world. And so they, as the Christian Women's Board of Missions is being founded, they begin to pray for the need for a missionary society. In fact, they're there in Cincinnati at the convention praying while this other organization is formed, and they will form what is called the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, the FCMS, the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. And it will be formed a year later, 1875, in Louisville, Kentucky. In its first year, the FCMS sends missionaries to Denmark, to England, and to France. And in fact, over the years, they're going to be an incredibly successful missionary organization, sending people all over the world. They will be a very, very successful organization. And one of the leaders of this group, who's going to come along after a few years, sometime after it's founded, will be a man named Archibald Maclean. Archibald Maclean he'd been a minister in Mount Healthy, Ohio, just north of Cincinnati. He also became a president at Bethany College. He became the president of the school sometime after Campbell's death, and then he ultimately decided that he had to be the corresponding secretary for this FCMS, this Foreign Christian Missionary Society. And that's a position he would hold from 1882 until his death in 1920. And Maclean took missions absolutely seriously. Everywhere he went, he recruited people for missions. He made it an effort. He wrote notes to the missionaries of the FCMS on pretty much a monthly basis. He sent gifts to them. He encouraged them. One year he took a worldwide tour. He went around the world. He sailed around the world going to meet the missionaries and encourage the missionaries. He's very, very involved and very concerned about missions. So this would be a very, very successful missionary society. Now, around the early 1900s, and especially into the 19 teens, there began to be some rumbling about the fact that there are three missionary societies. And you had some people who proposed the idea of how about we take all of these missionary societies and just make one group out of them. We just unite them into one society. And so this became an issue of discussion, and in 1919, these three societies, it was agreed, it was voted on the General Assembly that these three societies, along with 6 other agencies that had been developed within the Disciple of Christ Fellowship, that these would be put together as one overarching large society. These became known as the United Christian Missionary Society, the UCMS, the United Christian Missionary Society. Now, many people began to be very upset with this UCMS because the idea of it was that you'd have one society with kind of an overarching power. They had great control of everything. And so you're going to have people who say, oh, but if there's missionaries out there that we don't like or we don't care for what they're doing, why would we want to support them? We want to be able to support the different societies that support the ideas that we believe in. But in essence, what would happen is if people wanted to support missions, they basically had to send their money to the UCMS, and then the UCMS distributed it the way that they wanted to distribute it. They'd send the money to whichever missionaries they decided should be recipients of this money. And this became a problem. And plus there was an overhead cost for the UCMS. It was not cheap. It was very expensive. And so this began to emerge as a little bit of a difficulty for many within the Restoration movement, especially as we started to see ideas of liberalism emerging within the movement. As opponents looked at this, they began to stress the idea of maybe we need more autonomy, less control, less societies and individuals. And so you're going to have some that begin at this point in time going out as independent or direct support missions. One of the first will be W.D. Cunningham, who goes to Japan. Cunningham actually wanted to be part of the FCMS. He came down with polio, and after a few years of struggle, the FCMS would not let him go, and he decided, I'm going to Japan. I don't care. I'm going to go to preach the gospel in Japan regardless of what anybody else thinks. And if I don't have any support, I'm still going. And he ended up going to Japan and being an incredibly, incredibly successful missionary. But he went on a direct support basis, an independent missionary with no organization. Most at this time, however, had organizations. Now, some things began to develop in these organizations. As these organizations emerged more and more, you're going to have some of them who stress things like the social gospel. This becomes a big concern to many within the Restoration movement who say, we're not sending missionaries out there. I mean, certainly we want to help the needy. We want to do what we can with those who are hungry or need things, but we're about reaching people for Christ. And if your focus is more on social gospel than Christ, then that's really not what we're trying to support. So that became a little bit of an issue. Some began to promote open membership. And so you're going to have some who say, again, they say, wait a minute, that's not what we're about. We're not about these ideas of open membership. And so we really don't want to support this. But yet, if you want to support missions, you send your money to the Missionary Society. They decide who gets it. And you're even going to have some who promote something. In fact, the UCMS begins to promote an idea that becomes known as the Comity Agreement. The Comity Agreement is when a group of missionary organizations or denominations come together and they divide up a country. So, for instance, in Mexico, you're going to have a division where Presbyterians take one section of Mexico and the Methodists take another, and the disciples say, we'll take another. And you're even going to have some missionaries who are well established in these areas. And because of the Comity Agreement, they're told, okay, you're going to have to pick up and leave because now this area is controlled by another group. And when this happens, you're going to have groups like the Christian Restoration Association and the Christian Standard who jump in and say, wait a minute, you stay down there where you're working, and we're going to raise the support to keep you at work there. And so this will happen in Mexico. This will also happen in the Philippines. In the Philippines, Leslie Wolf was a missionary there, and he's going to work there from. He's going to work there for many years, but he lives from 1876 to 1945, and in 1925, the UCMS came up with a Comity Agreement. And they told Wolf, who had established a printing press, he had established the Manila Bible Institute, he'd established schools, he'd established all kinds of things in Manila. And the UCMS told him, you're going to have to move because Manila is no longer within the region that we are evangelizing. We've come up with a Comity Agreement, you're going to have to move somewhere else. Leslie Wolf was very upset with this. I've established a lot here. I don't want to move. They said, well, this is too bad. This is just simply too bad. You're going to have to move or we're going to cut your funding. So Wolf feels like he's going to have to move, but then the Christian Restoration Association, Christian Standard jump in and they tell him to stay there. They raise the support to keep him working there. And Wolf in 1926 was brought to the National Convention, the General Assembly of the Disciples of Christ, to tell his story. And it was thought if he told this story that the general populace of the disciples would accept what he's saying and buy into it. But yet he was kind of relegated kind of to the side, kind of made to look foolish and not given much time to present his ideas. And it became a real kind of a thorn in the side to the conservatives. And so a group of them in Memphis, Tennessee, walked out of the assembly. They were led by P.H. Welshamer, the prolific and minister of the largest church within the Restoration Movement, a church in Canton, Ohio. And Welshamer led them down the street to the Pantages Theater, where they came together and they met and they arranged for a new convention that would not vote on things or not make determinations about things, but would simply be an assembly for preaching, teaching, and fellowship. And the next year, in 1927, we have the beginning of what will become this new group. This will be the North American Christian Convention. And so you have a movement that sort of begins. While it wasn't a formal split or a formal separation at this time, you're going to have a conservative element of disciples, a more liberal element of disciples, and then you're going to have this non-instrumental group. And we'll talk about where they all line up as we move forward. But this is going to be, these mission issues, along with the theological liberalism, are going to be the issues that sort of divide a second time. The division starts in 1927, and actually the actual listing of separation between the disciples and what becomes the Christian churches and churches of Christ, the more conservative element of the disciples, an instrumental group, is going to be, the official listing of separation is in 1971. But the real separation takes place many years before then.